And you know what? They're just my opinions, so it's okay. Now this one might be really obvious to you, but you really need to familiarize yourself with your own particular sewing machine. Now I know we all have, different sewing machines and whatnot, but friends, you really do need to read your manual. I mean, honestly, that is the best point of reference to see what exactly your machine does and what it can do for you. As far as quilting goes and knowing the basics about your sewing machine, and if you're just quilting, piecing your pieces together in quilting, you need a straight stitch. So if you have just a straight stitch machine, then you're golden. And even if you don't and you have all these other stitches, you probably still do have a straight stitch sewing machine. Typically for quilting and piecing, you'll want to set that stitch length to 2 millimeters. My phone just fell, so I have a different perspective now, so bear with me because I'm watching the road and not my phone. So just FYI on that too. I'm in my driveway now, so I can actually look at you. Next thing that I'm going to say is probably a bit controversial in quilting, in the quilting world anyways. But I typically backstitch all the time on my blocks because, I don't like to see even a little bit come undone. I don't want these quilt blocks that I've spent all these hours piecing together, I don't want them to come undone. So your machine, if you have a backstitch, get familiar with that. If you don't backstitch, you may have to redo seams, and nobody wants to do a redo, right? So yeah, know your sewing machine and know what your sewing machine can do for you when it comes to quilting. My grandma always said, hair up in the kitchen, no matter if you're cooking or not. Let's talk about after you have your design all set, you have your pattern all set, and you want to pick out some fabric, right? Picking out fabric is hard sometimes because we don't know what colors go with what. So a lot of times you can just pick out bundles and buy them like that, like fat quarter bundles. That will give you all of the colors that are in the line of that particular, fabric set. One tool that really does help me when it comes to picking out colors is a color wheel. Some of you might know what a color wheel is, some of you might not know. Well, with a color wheel, it kind of gives you instructions with it too, what color goes with what. So the yellow and the purple, they are across each other on the color wheel and they complement each other. And that's a good way to know whether or not whatever colors you're using go with one another. They even have 3 sets of colors that go together and all that. And it's a really good thing to have in your arsenal of quilting to get you on the right track if you have trouble picking out, fabric colors and such. Now with scrap quilts though, you can go anything goes because it doesn't really matter what colors you put in a scrap quilt, especially if you want it to look really scrappy and colorful, right? I mean, I love scrap quilting. I've even made scrap bins, my scrap wall of fame in my sewing room, all is color coded so that it inspires me every time I walk into my sewing room. So you really don't need to know color theory, so to speak. You just really need to know how to read a color wheel, and you need to know how to buy bundles of fabric that are in the same line that go together. Let's talk about patterns, quilt patterns in particular. If you've been around my channel long enough, you know this quilter right here does not do patterns well at all. For whatever reason, I have a hard time reading patterns and following them. Let me know in the comments, do you have that same problem? We're probably quilty sisters if we have that same problem together. So anyways, back to patterns. You'll notice I don't follow any patterns at all, really. I make them up myself. Yeah, that's why I have so many made up patterns on my channel. Click the link in the description box below if you want to see what patterns I have for sale and what patterns I have for free. Some of the lingo and patterns can get a little daunting. Some of the basic terms within a quilt pattern would be wrong sides together, right sides together. Typically it's right sides together unless you're doing a French seam, but I don't know why you would be doing a French seam in quilting. So typically it's right sides together, and it'll say RST, which means right sides together. Cut on the bias means if you have a square, you're going to go corner to corner on that square. One of the biggest ones that I get confused about, or used to get confused about because now I've kind of trained myself, finished block versus unfinished block. So this is where unfinished, finished, and trimmed can get confused within a pattern. I know I always did. An unfinished block is like, say, a 9 patch that you've, connected all the squares together, right? There's 9 squares and you've connected them 3, 3, and 3. Once you've sewn all of them together, you would think that that would be unfinished, but it's not yet anyways. Now you have to trim it to the size that it needs to be to go into the quilt, right? Say your 9 patch needs to be 10 inches square. After you sew it together and then you press it, that is considered a pre-trimmed, unfinished block. Now when you take it to your table and you actually trim it to the 10 inches that you need it to be to go into the quilt, so you've trimmed it 10 inches, now it becomes a 10-inch block unfinished. Yeah. Now, what is a finished block? A finished block is one that has been all sewn together, pressed, trimmed to the unfinished size, right, of 10 inches. Then, once it goes into the quilt, you need to take a 1/4 inch off of all 4 sides. You're essentially taking off 1/2 inch going up and 1/2 inch going across, which means now you have a 9.5 finished square. See how it can get confusing, right? I hope y'all understood that though. Patterns are good sometimes when you need to know like how much fabric you need to buy for this particular quilt project, right? So that really helps. That I could see where that would be helpful. But me, I don't do that. I, quilt as I go and figure it out as I go because I like to make up my own patterns when it comes to quilting. Patterns will also be good for telling you what the end result quilt will be too. If I were new and beginner, I would totally look for patterns that say beginner friendly for new quilters. Try an easy one at first. That way you can go through it and kind of get the gist of what you need to do in order to get that quilt, somewhat presentable, right? The one thing you do need to remember too when it comes to quilt blocks, you can only connect one quilt block that is the same size to the next quilt block. If I have a 10-inch block, the next block in the row needs to be 10 inches, not 10.25 inches and, all that crazy. That's how we get, messed up and everything. So 10-inch block needs to be connected to a 10-inch block. I hope that cleared up a little bit about patterns. They are really hard to read sometimes, honestly. I'm not going to lie to you about that. So that's why it's best to just buy something simple first and then go for it. Have you ever wondered when you cut your fabric, into strips or whatever, and then you put it into a quilt block, you subcut them and put them into a quilt block? Have you ever wondered, where does the line go on the ruler as opposed to the edge of the fabric? Do you hover over it? Do you put it on the inside of the line? Or do you put it on the outside of the line so you can see some fabric peeking out? Good question, right? When I first started quilting, I often wondered that same thing. Like, what the heck? Where does the line go? Someone tell me. So let me help you out with that. And that consistency is king in quilting. Yep. As long as you do the same thing to every single block, in every single way, in the same quilt, you'll be golden. So typically the way I do it, I do hover that line on the ruler on the edge of the fabric. I can't see the fabric off the edge, but that's how I gauge it. So I don't know. So yeah, consistency is where it's at. So So let's talk about basting our quilt sandwich. Pin basting versus spray adhesive basting, and there's even another one, and that is like sew basting into your quilt, like taking needle and thread and making big, huge stitches between all the layers of your quilt sandwich. If you didn't know what a quilt sandwich was, it's the quilt top, the one that you've pieced together, you know, that pretty outside piece. Then there's a batting on the inside, and then there is yet another layer, which is your backing. Now, when you go to quilt this quilt, you need to make sure that all those layers are together, because if you don't, I mean, you're going to have shifting everywhere and your stitches might get, you know, caught up. So you want to make sure that you baste your quilt sandwich together for sure. I actually do them both. I spray adhesive base and I pin base both, because I want to make sure that they stay together, and I'm always afraid that things are going to shift if I don't do them both. And typically I use huge pins. A lot of people say that you shouldn't use huge pins, you know, but I figure since I'm doing both, the spray adhesive and the other, you know, I think my quilt top's staying together. It's really just a matter of preference, you know. The spray adhesive base, like the 505 that I use, it is extremely expensive. I mean, really expensive. So if you can pin base, then, you know, you're going to save yourself a lot of money because you can reuse those pins. But here's the thing with pin basting, you have to put a lot of pins if you don't do anything else. Some people may even put the stitches in, the stay stitches, real big ones in their quilt, and pin base, so you can do that as well. I really do encourage you to try all three methods to see what really works for you. Some people swear by pin basting only, and some people only spray base their quilt. And a lot of people actually still do the big stay stitching within their quilt sandwich to hold their pieces together. If that's you, put that in the comments. I'd like to know who all stay stitches their quilt sandwich together still. That'd be interesting. These are going to be roasted peppers, and they are going to be yummy. Yummy, I tell you, with some sauce and meatballs. Oh yeah. My husband will be excited, at least he gets to eat tonight. And I'll tell him, babe, I worked all day on a quilting video and I still got all this dinner done for you. Superwoman. I'm totally not, let me tell you. So that's basting your quilt sandwich 101. So what about pre-washing your fabric before you even cut and make your quilt? I totally have some opinions about this. And you know what? They're just my opinions, so it's okay. A lot of people talk about flannel, although I'll get to cotton in a second, but a lot of people say that flannel, when you put that as your backing on your quilt, or any part of your quilt, even if you put it on the inside, they say that you should pre-wash it prior. Well, I don't, and I did that one time. The first time someone had told me that I shouldn't do that, I went ahead and did that. And I never did it again, because you know what? It doesn't matter at all. At all. I'm telling you, I've even used really cheap flannel from Joann Fabrics, and I kid you not, it shrunk up just the same as if, you know, I didn't or did do it or whatever. So yeah, you do not need to pre-wash. So needless to say, nothing bad happened to my flannel quilt that I did. Nothing at all. It just, you know, came beautiful. In my quilting journey, I have washed my quilt afterwards, after using the flannel, on hot water and hot heat in the dryer, and nothing happened to it. Came out beautiful. So I don't know, go figure, and that's even with cheaper fabric. Now when it comes to quilting cotton, I have some different opinions. Normally, I do not, I tell you, I do not pre-wash my quilting cotton, ever, I tell you. I know some people do, but I do not. Nope, not at all. I just don't have time to pre-wash, and nor would I want to, because the fabric comes with a bit of sizing on it, and all that is just like this chemical or whatever that keeps that fabric nice and stiff. And when you wash it, you're totally taking that out. And so that's why it's so flimsy, kind of, you know. You know, there's always an exception to the rule, right? So that being said, if I have a really, really red fabric that I think is going to cause me harm, because mind you, I've never had one fabric turn on me except with red. And I'm going to pop a picture here because, yeah, I never showed it to you on the original video when I did this quilt because I was so upset. But I'll show you now. I'll come clean with this. My triangle quilt that I did, I used a red fabric in there and it bled onto the white. Yes, it did. So now I don't take any chances. Like when I did the clown quilt, that red fabric that I used within the diamonds, I totally pre-washed that. Oh yeah. So lesson learned. But for the most part, no worries. No, it's not going to bleed. Red's the problem. First thing you want to try to understand when you start off quilting is those quilt terms, right? So you know what the heck you're doing because, you know, you just don't know what you don't know. So a quilt block is one block that has several pieces within it that needs to be connected to another piece in the quilt so that it makes a whole quilt. So many of those quilt blocks, but within those quilt blocks are several pieces. Sashing, for instance, sashing are those strips of fabric that are between the quilt blocks. Now, that essentially just makes the quilt bigger and it adds like a definition between the blocks. There are lists on the internet to get you up to speed with all of the quilting terms, but there is one that I want to tell you so that you don't make the mistake that I did. I was a little embarrassed about this at first, but then afterward I'm like, you know what? You don't know what you don't know. So I didn't know what it was and now I do, and I'll use the term correctly. I'm not going to tell you which video it was, but it was a very early video of mine, and I used the term off kilter. Now I was using that term off kilter because I was turning my blocks into a diamond shape almost, so the 2 points were up and down and off to the side. So I took a square, pretend like this is a square, I took a square and turned it like this. What I didn't know was I was literally turning that block on point. I did not know what that meant, setting your block on point. Needless to say, I never forgot that term again. Now I know what putting a quilt block on point is. But, you know, I didn't at the beginning. Knowing how the fabric is manufactured and how it's actually made, that might help you within your quilting. Not might, it will help you with your quilting when you go to piece blocks together and just in general. When fabric's made, it's connected on one side and the other side, and then it weaves all the fabric together. I don't know the ins and outs of that part, but I can tell you that the part that it's connected to on one side and the part that it's connected to on the other side, that's called the selvage. Selvage looks a lot different than the fabric print itself. It typically has writing on it, what the line of fabric is, who manufactured it, you know, produced it and whatnot. Sometimes there's even a year on it, and sometimes it'll just look like a funny edge that looks kind of like a nice bound edge. That fabric typically for quilting cotton is 42 inches in between that, from selvage to selvage. That part right along here is where the worker at the store cuts that fabric. It's from selvage to selvage. Now the fabric that runs along the selvage area, that's called the grain. Now when the fabric runs along the grain, you can literally pull that fabric and it's not going to stretch. But if you pulled the fabric from selvage to selvage, took it and literally pulled on it, it would have a stretch to it. So when patterns call for cutting on the bias, or whenever you hear the term bias, what you need to know about the bias is that when you cut from selvage at the top, diagonally down at a 45-degree angle to the bottom of another selvage of that fabric, that's cutting on the bias. And when you pull bias like that back and forth, you get a lot of stretch there. Take a jelly roll strip, for instance. When you lay a jelly roll strip down that one is actually cut salvage to salvage, so it has some stretch in it. So if you go to pull that, that'll really stretch. And when you go to iron that, you need to be really careful when you iron the jelly roll strips because it will bow and it will cause, you know, all kind of havoc up in your quilt. The more information you have about what your fabric's going to do and how it's going to react, the better quilter that you're going to be. Let's talk about 1/4 inch seam allowances, the lack thereof, or the abundance thereof. Let me tell you what I mean. A 1/4 inch in quilting is that space between the needle and the edge of the fabric. That needle pushes the thread down into the fabric, right? So say we put right sides together, 2 pieces of quilting cotton, 2 blocks. Now we need to sew that edge together at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you need to measure from the needle over a 1/4 inch to the edge of your fabric. And that's a 1/4 inch seam allowance in quilting. Now, on my particular sewing machine, the Juki TL18, it actually comes with a scant 1/4 inch presser foot. Now, a scant 1/4 inch presser foot measures from the needle over to the edge of the presser foot, and that is exactly a scant 1/4 inch. So that's just shy of a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I know it might seem confusing in quilting, but can I tell you this? No matter if you use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, or if you go just a bit more than a 1/4 inch seam allowance, as long as you are consistent throughout that entire quilt, your quilt will be fine. I'm telling you, you will be totally fine. Now this is where we come into problem. So say that you started sewing at exactly a 1/4 inch seam allowance at the beginning of your quilt. Then you took a break with it, set it aside. You picked it back up again. Well, you forgot what you were even doing. So then you just said, I'm just going to go a scant 1/4 inch. I'm going to go just shy because that's what I've been doing lately, right? I mean, that's the thought process. You're not even thinking about what you did prior. So now you've incorporated a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance into your quilt. So that's not going to work, friends. You see, you've been inconsistent now with that seam allowance. Had you have just stayed at that same 1/4 inch seam allowance through the whole quilt, you would have been fine. But now that you've kind of switched it up a bit, now you're going to either have more to trim off, less to trim off, or maybe, worst case scenario, they're not going to fit together at all and it's going to totally mess up your entire quilt. It's serious, I know. You know, not a lot gets said about it, but I mean, it doesn't matter what you use. Just be consistent within that 1/4 inch seam. I mean, I wouldn't do a 1/2 inch. I really wouldn't. But I would definitely measure from the edge of the fabric over to the needle to make sure that you do that every single time. Sometimes you can move your needle within your sewing machine to where you need it to be as opposed with the edge of the fabric. So you need to do that if you can. My foot on my sewing machine just happens to be a scant 1/4 inch. Now I can buy a Juki foot that is exactly a 1/4 inch. So there's a few things that can be done there. So yeah. So the main thing with that whole 1/4 inch scandal is that you need to be consistent and just do the same thing throughout the whole quilt. And you'll be golden. So let's talk about the different types of quilting. There's regular quilting, like piecing it through the sewing machine, taking all the pieces and connecting them with the sewing machine. Then there's applique quilts. That's where you would take an outline of, say, a heart or something, adhere it to a stiffer piece of like interfacing type thing. Then you would stick that onto your quilt as like a motif or something and then stitch around it so that it stays down. And there's foundation paper piecing quilts where you would take these pieces of paper that have lines on them and numbers and you lay the fabric down, turn it over to the wrong side, sew it, fold it back, press it, and then keep going. a lot of people find it tricky, so they don't even go down the rabbit hole of foundation paper piecing. And then there is English paper piecing. English paper piecing is something that I have recently come to love. English paper piecing is where you take a shape of a piece of paper and you lay it down on a piece of fabric and you fold that over. You can glue baste it, or you can sew baste that fabric onto the paper. So say it's like a hexagon or something, and you would just kind of fold that over so that it molds to the shape of that piece of paper. So you do that several times over, and you take and you connect those shapes by hand sewing. Which at first, you know, it seemed like it might be a little daunting. And at first I honestly was like, oh, I really don't think that I can do this. But then, you know what? I said, Tracy, you surely can do this. You know you can. Just put your mind to it. And so I just persevered and I kept going, and now I'm well into this quilt. It is going to take a while for this quilt to be finished, but I love just sitting down at night. This is the hot spot right here in the evening for me. Make sure that you have lots of light if you're going to be doing some handwork in the evening where it's kind of dusky dark, right? I have this Cricut light that my mom had given to me. She has a matching one, and she got another one she wanted or something, and she gave it to me, her second one. So I have this, and this brings in so much light. Trust me, you don't want to strain your eyes when you're doing this tiny work in front of you. So this is what I do in the evening. This is where you'll find me. I sit here now, and I just really have fallen in love with this type of quilting. It is some of the most relaxing, therapeutic. I don't know. It's just crazy to me how much I love this, because if you would have asked me, oh, a few years back, Tracy, are you ever going to hand sew? Why don't you hand sew? I would have been like, you are crazy out of your gourd. There's no way that I'm going to hand sew anything. But you know what? Things change. You know, our tastes get a little different. Say we learn certain things within quilting, and then we want to go to the next level. You know, and for me, this right here, English paper piecing, is the next level for me. It stretched me, there's no doubt about it, but I just find so much solace in it. I really do. So there's a few ways to construct a quilt. The regular way, piecing on the sewing machine, which I absolutely adore as well. There's applique quilting, you know, where you would put that shape onto the quilt. I love that as well. I actually did my first granddaughter's quilt with the Mickey heads. I'll pop a picture here of that, and that one was so much fun to make. I loved making that, and free motion quilting that was so much fun. I've tried foundation paper piecing, and I'm not, you know, all that keen on it, but this right here, English paper piecing, like I said, I would have never thought it was for me, but it is. I've heard this saying before, there's many ways to skin a cat, which I don't know why anybody would ever say that, because it sounds disgusting to me, but I get it. We have to come up with a new way to say that, like there's many ways to quilt a quilt, or there's many ways to construct a quilt. Or I don't know. If you guys have some ideas of some sayings, leave them down in the comments below. I am filming my progress on this EPP project, and soon enough, probably not real soon, but somewhere in the future, I will be doing a major video on this right here, because I love it so much that I cannot not do a video on this and share with you all my journey on this particular project. Honestly, I don't know what I'm going to do when it's over. I'm going to have to start a new one, because this has become the regular nighttime ritual for me that I just adore. There are so many tips and tricks that I have to share with you on this. I can't wait. I had pictured this next scene for you outside, so I'm going to stick to my guns, and I'm out here, but it is a little bit chilly, so I did grab a quilt. Let's talk needles and thread. All new beginners when it comes to quilting or any sewing in general, they don't know what needle and thread to use. Let me assure all of my new quilters and even my veteran quilters, when it comes to quilting, piecing quilts, and even free motion quilting or doing some straight line stitching quilting in your quilts, if you own a domestic sewing machine, home sewing machine, an 80-12 is going to work great for you. By 80-12, I mean those are the numbers for the needle. If you have more of an industrial sewing machine like I do, I go for the 90-14. Mine's semi-industrial. It's really not though. It's for home sewing, but they say because, you know, it has a hard metal case on the sewing machine that it's more industrial. Let me pop a picture right here of a graph that's totally going to help you out. Now this picture that I've popped up, it's kind of just like a guideline, rule of thumb. So that way when you go to shop for your needles and your thread, it's a no-brainer, right? Just pull this picture out and look at it. It is freezing out here. Yesterday it was 80 and today it feels like it's 50. I don't know. I think I'm going to do the rest of my filming inside somewhere. Let's talk about how expensive quilting can be. I know that that is a concern of a lot of new quilters because they're like, how am I going to afford all this designer fabric and all this batting and all these notions that, you know, go with quilting? Well, I will tell you there's, you know, a lot of different gadgets and things to buy to help you make the quilt. But when it comes down to it, I mean, our ancestors, they just had a needle and thread and some scraps. So go figure, right? Nowadays, we got everything underneath the sun to help us make our quilts. And a lot of it is mostly fun to use, I will admit. But you really don't need all the things that they say that you need all the things. You just really don't, in my opinion. But friends, quilting can be affordable. And I'm going to share with you right now how I think that quilting can be affordable. Now, do you have to buy designer fabric? If you can afford it, I mean, there is a lot of pretty designer fabric out there for sure. But you don't have to buy designer fabric. There are alternatives. There is Joann Fabrics, which is a big box store, you know, and they sell a ton of fabric in all different, you know, cotton, polyester, knit, whatever you need. Now, my Joann Fabrics in my town, it closed down. If you've been around my channel long enough, you know it was a sad time for me. Now, as far as I know, there was a list of stores, Joann Fabrics, that did close down, but there are still some that are open, and I guess as for right now, you can shop online there too. So there's that. There's also Hobby Lobby. They have some really good deals. Every other week, they take either 30 or 40% off of their fabric, and I forget, you know, the exact number. But one week, you know, the quilting cotton will be $12.99, and then the next week it will be 40% off that, say. So that's a really good deal too. You just have to pick the right week to shop there. I even see at some Dollar Trees that they are starting to sell fabric, or they have been selling it for a couple years now. I mean, I don't really buy my fabric from the Dollar Tree, but they do sell fat quarter rolls. Quality though, you have to feel it, because sometimes you can feel the quality is bad and sometimes you can feel that the quality is very good or it's decent. Hobby Lobby, for the most part, everything I've ever bought from them, quilting cotton wise, I've never had an issue with. Is very nice, the feel is nice, and you know, so there's that. The other option, you can go to the thrift store and you can use the thick blankets that you find at the thrift store for batting. I've done that before. Also on my channel, I've went to the thrift store, the Goodwill, and I bought a bunch of flannel shirts and I cut them up into pieces, and I made my husband a quilt this last Christmas, and it turned out great. So there's lots of ways that you can thrift your way around when it comes to quilting. Honestly, you never know what you're going to find at the Goodwill. I have found really nice rulers at the Goodwill, rotary cutters, scissors. I mean, I don't know if these people are just done with quilting or maybe, you know, they passed away. I don't know. And their family just gave it. I'm not sure. But I find a lot of good notions at the Goodwill, and even good thread. If you look you know, deep enough, you're going to find it. I'm telling you. So don't ever discount the fact that there are nice things at the Goodwill, because there are friends. Trust me, I've found them. Also at the Goodwill, I have found hundreds, and I mean hundreds, of quilting books. And that has helped me in my journey as well. And don't forget, there's always Walmart. Now I know it's controversial with quilters. You know, I call them, you know, fabric snobs. I have a couple friends that are fabric snobs, but I'm not one of those. They will not even buy fabric from Walmart. And I don't know why. Walmart fabric is not that bad. Trust me. All you have to do is grab the fabric at Walmart and just feel it with your fingers. If it feels rough or it feels like it's, you know, just, I don't know, or if it feels really stiff, like it has no drapey hand to it, so to speak, just put it back. And let me tell you, I don't know if this is a racket or not, but I have seen fabric that's been at Joann Fabrics, and I've seen fabric that's been at Walmart. And I've also seen it in like a designer fabric line, the same identical print. Now, I don't know if they're all, you know, the same person or not. I don't know if it's the same designer or whatnot. I have no clue. I can tell you that I remember weird stuff like that when I see it. And so I don't know if those three things were all the same designer and just put out there, say to Joann's, Walmart, and then the designer, you know. I mean, I don't know. I'm suspect. So I'm sure the reputable brands of designers don't do that, but there are some that do. So keep your eye out. So all Walmart fabric is not bad. That's all I'm saying. I use Walmart fabric in my quilting. It's affordable. It's right here in my town. I just go if I'm looking for a color, if I'm looking for something, you know, in particular. They do have a lot of Disney fabric there. You know, you could make little things for your grandkids and different things. I mean, you know, honestly, don't be that fabric snob. Go there, look at it, check it out. So for me, when it comes to quilting cotton, I have no bias. If I like it and it's pretty to me, I buy it. Now, I know I haven't covered everything about quilting in this one video. I don't know, maybe there'll be a part 2, so you let me know in the comments if you'd like a part 2. But there is one last thing that I would like to talk about, and that is patience and persistence. Of course, you have to have the drive within you as a creative that you want to make something creative, right? So honestly, I would just encourage all of you as new quilters to keep learning and to be patient and persistent with this thing that we call quilting. There's more to learn, I know, but we only have so much time in one video, right? With that being said, until next time on the Sewing Channel, take care.